Welcome back to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we continue our cozy retelling of The Secret Garden. Episode 12, He Walks, and they laugh. Let's begin. Dr. Craven had been waiting for some time at the house when they returned to it, and though he had not sent for them, there had been a quiet uneasiness in him which made his step quicker when he heard voices in the hall. The day had been longer than he thought wise for such an experiment, and as Colin was brought back to his room, he looked at the boy with a care that was not unkind, though it was firm. "You should not have stayed so long," he said. "You must not overexert yourself." Colin, who had been carried in with less ceremony than usual, had insisted on sitting upright rather than being laid at once upon the bed, turned his face toward him without the faintest sign of weariness. There was color in his cheeks still, and his eyes held a brightness which had not been there before. "I am not tired at all," he answered. "It has made me well. Tomorrow I'm going out in the morning as well as in the afternoon." Dr. Craven hesitated. He was a man accustomed to giving orders that were obeyed, and though he had never governed Colin with harshness, he had governed him entirely. Something in the boy's manner gave him pause. "I am not sure I can allow it," he said after a moment. "I'm afraid it would not be wise." Colin didn't raise his voice, nor did he show impatience in the way he had once done. But there was a steadiness in him which made the words fall with the weight of their own. "It would not be wise to try and stop me," he said. "I am going." The room grew still after that. Dr. Craven looked at him as if he would have spoken again, but didn't. There was something unfamiliar in the boy before him, something that was neither weakness nor petulance, but a quiet resolve that did not seek permission. At length, he gave a slight uncertain nod, as if acknowledging something he could not quite measure, and after a few further instructions, he took his leave. When the door had closed behind him, the air of the room seemed to change, though nothing visible had altered. Mary had been standing not far from the bed, watching without appearing to do so, and now she drew a chair nearer and sat down. She didn't speak at once. Instead, she looked at Colin with a steady, thoughtful gaze, as though she were considering something she had only just begun to understand. She had discovered, not long since, that there were things about him which had never been questioned, simply because no one had thought to question them. He had lived so long as though alone in a world arranged for him that he had never learned that other ways existed. She herself had not been so very different, though she had come to see it sooner. Since she had been at Misselthwaite, she had begun, little by little, to notice her own ways and to measure them against the ways of others. It had not made her softer, exactly, but it had made her more aware, and now, looking at Colin, she found herself wondering about him in the same manner. He became conscious, after a few moments, that she was observing him. "What are you looking at me for?" he asked. "I'm thinking that I'm rather sorry for Dr. Craven," she said. "So am I," Colin answered calmly, though there was something in his tone which held a faint note of satisfaction. "He won't get Misselthwaite at all now. I'm not going to die." Mary considered this, but shook her head slightly. "I'm sorry for him because of that, of course," she said. "But I was thinking just then that it must have been very horrid to have had to be polite for 10 years to a boy who was always rude. I would have never done it." Colin looked at her without a sign of offense. He seemed rather to be weighing her words than resisting them. "Am I rude?" he inquired. "If you had been his own boy, and he had been a slapping sort of man," Mary said, with her usual plainness, "he would have slapped you." "But he daren't," Colin replied. "No, he daren't," said Mary, thinking the matter through with complete seriousness. "Nobody ever dared to do anything you didn't like, because you were going to die, and things like that. You were such a poor thing." Colin's brows drew together slightly, not in anger, but in a kind of gathering thought. "But," he said after a moment, with quiet determination, "I am not going to be a poor thing. I won't let people think I'm one. I stood on my feet this afternoon." Mary nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already begun to believe. "It is always having your own way that has made you so queer," she said, speaking almost as if she were explaining it to herself. Colin turned his head quickly. "Am I queer?" he demanded. "Yes," she answered. "Very. But you needn't be cross," she added, with impartial air, "because so am I queer, and so is Ben Weatherstaff. But I am not as queer as I was before I began to like people, and before I found the garden." Colin was silent for a while. The word did not seem to trouble him much as the idea behind it. He lay still, his face thoughtful. And then, quite gradually, something in his expression altered. A small smile began at the corner of his mouth and grew until it changed into his whole countenance. "I shall stop being queer," he said at last, "if I go every day to the garden." Mary looked at him with a quiet certainty. "So shall I," she said. "There is magic in there," Colin went on, more softly now, as though he were speaking of something he did not wish to disturb. "Good magic. I'm sure there is." "So am I," said Mary. He turned his head a little on the pillow, still smiling, though his eyes were very thoughtful. "Even if it isn't real magic," he said, "we can pretend it is. Something is there. Something." Mary didn't answer at once, but after a moment she spoke in a tone as simple as if she were stating a fact that she had come to understand without question. "It's magic," she said, "but not black. It's as white as snow." And in the quiet of the room, the words seemed to rest between them, not as something fanciful, but as something they had both begun, in their own ways, to believe. The days that followed seemed at first to gather themselves quietly, as though nothing remarkable were taking place. And yet there was a sense, subtle but persistent, that something had begun which would not easily be undone. The garden, which had once been still and enclosed, no more than a hidden place beyond a locked door, did not remain as it had been. It altered, and it altered steadily. Green things pushed upward through the earth with a kind of quiet insistence. They came in the grass and in the beds, and even in the narrow crevices between the old stones of the walls. At first, the changes were small, so small that one might have missed them if one had not been looking. But the children looked, and they learned to look. The first tender shoots deepened in color, and then, almost before it seemed possible, buds appeared, small, tightly held, as though they kept some secret of their own. Day by day they swelled, and then, with a patience that did not hurry itself, they began to open. Color followed. It didn't come all at once, but in a gradual unfolding. Here a soft blue, there a deeper purple, and then a sudden brightness of crimson that seemed to catch and hold the light. The garden, which had once been a place of waiting, became a place of answering. It filled itself. Flowers found their way into every space. They settled into corners, climbed into hollows, leaned against stone, and stretched upward as though they had been long preparing for this moment. Iris rose in pale sheaves, and white lilies lifted themselves from the grass, and in the green alcoves there grew tall, clustered spires of delphinium and columbine, standing close together like quiet companies of watchers. Ben Weatherstaff had seen much of it before, and yet even he did not move among it with a certain attention. He had helped, in his way, long ago, setting earth between the bricks, making places where things might take root and cling. Now, as he stood sometimes with the children, he would speak of it, not as one who instructed, but as one who remembered. "She was main fond of 'em," he said once, glancing toward a line of blue flowers that lifted themselves lightly against the sky. "She was. She liked them things and was always pointing up to the blue sky. Said it made her feel as if they was glad." Mary listened without speaking. There was something in the way he said it that didn't ask for a reply. It seemed enough that the words were spoken, and they were heard. The seeds she and Dickon had planted did not lag behind. They grew with a steadiness that felt almost purposeful, as though they had taken their place among the older things without question. Poppies appeared, soft and bright, moving lightly in the breeze, their petals catching the air and shifting it. They didn't seem shy among the others, though they were new. They stood where they had been set, as though they belonged. And the roses, those which had been hidden in tangle and shadow, spread themselves in every direction. They climbed along the walls and reached across the branches of the trees, weaving themselves into garlands that draped and fell and lifted again. Buds formed and opened, one after another, until it seemed that the air itself was altered by their presence. There were hours when the garden felt almost full of breath. Colin saw it. He did not merely pass through it, nor did he sit apart from it as something to be observed from a distance. Each morning he was brought out, and each day he remained as long as the weather allowed, even when the sky was gray and the light subdued. It didn't lessen his interest. If anything, it deepened it. He lay often upon the grass, his head tilted slightly, watching. He watched not only the flowers, but the small, constant movements that filled the spaces between them. If one remained still long enough, he had discovered, things revealed themselves. Tiny creatures moved with purpose along unseen paths. Ants carried fragments larger than themselves, navigating the uneven ground with a certainty that didn't falter. Beetles passed from shadow into light and back again, intent upon their errands. Bees drifted from bloom to bloom, pausing only as long as was necessary before moving on. Once, for the better part of the morning, he had watched a mole at work. It had broken through the earth with patient determination, its small body emerging with effort, its claws pressing and pushing as it found its way upward. There had been nothing hurried in it, and nothing wasted. It simply continued, as though it had always known what must be done. Dickens spoke of such things easily, adding to what Colin saw with what he himself knew. He named creatures and habits and places, not as one reciting knowledge, but as one who had lived among them. And there seemed to be no end to it. One thing led to another, and another still, until the garden was no longer a single space, but a gathering of many lives, all moving together. It was not the only garden that occupied Colin's thoughts. The fact that he stood upon his feet, that he felt the ground beneath him and remained there, returned to him again and again. He spoke of it often, not with excitement that burst outward, but with a steady conviction that seemed to grow stronger each time it was spoken. "There must be a great deal of magic in the world," he said one morning, when the air was still and the light lay softly over the grass. "But people don't know what it is like, or how to make it." He paused, considering this as though it were something to be worked out rather than merely admired. "Perhaps," he went on, "the beginning is just to say that nice things are going to happen, and then to make them happen." He didn't look at Mary as he spoke, nor did he wait for her answer. It wasn't said for agreement, but because it seemed to him to be true. "I'm going to try," he added. "I'm going to make an experiment." The next morning, when they entered the garden again, there was a different kind of purpose in him. He stood upon his feet beneath one of the trees, not leaning, not wavering, but upright and still, as though he wished to feel the steadiness of it. He sent at once for Ben Weatherstaff. Ben came as quickly as he could, and when we reached the garden, he stopped for a moment, looking at the boy before him. There was something in the sight that held him, a quiet kind of pride, perhaps, though he couldn't name it. "Good morning, Ben Weatherstaff," Colin said. "I want you and Dickon and Miss Mary to stand in a row and listen to me, because I'm going to tell you something very important." "Aye, aye, sir," Ben answered, touching his forehead with a rough sort of formality, which did not lack respect. "I am going to try a scientific experiment," Colin continued. "When I grow up, I'm going to make great scientific discoveries. I'm going to begin now with this experiment." "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben again, as promptly as before, though his eyes held a look of interest. He did not trouble to hide. Mary, who had not heard of such discoveries until now, watched Colin closely. There was something in him that made belief come more easily than doubt. When he lifted his head and fixed his eyes upon you, it was difficult not to feel what he said might indeed come to pass. For a moment, after Colin had finished speaking, no one moved. The garden seemed to hold the words as though they had settled into it, not vanishing as ordinary speech did, but remaining in some quieter way, as if they had taken root. Colin himself stood very still beneath the tree. The effort of standing had not passed unnoticed by him, but neither had it troubled him. There was something in the steadiness of the ground beneath his feet which seemed to reassure him more deeply than any words could have done. He drew a slow breath, not from weariness, but from a kind of satisfaction, as though he were learning something new, simply by remaining where he was. Dickon hadn't spoken while Colin talked. He stood with his animals about him, nut and shell perched easily, the white rabbit resting against his arm, its ears lying soft along its back. He listened in his quiet way, not questioning, not interrupting, but taking in each word as though it were no stranger than anything else he had heard in the open air. When Colin ceased, Dickon's eyes were bright, though his expression remained calm. "Tha's right," he said at last, in a tone that carried no doubt. "There's summat in it." It wasn't said as agreement alone, but as recognition. Mary glanced at him, and then back at Colin. She had felt something of the same thing, though she would not have spoken it so simply. There had been moments in the garden when she had known, without trying to explain it, that something was at work, something that didn't belong to the seeds in the soil. And now, hearing Colin speak of it, she found the thought did not seem so strange to her. Colin looked from one to the other of them, as if measuring the effect of what he had said. He did not smile in triumph, nor did he look for praise. Instead, he nodded once, as though confirming something within himself. "Then we shall begin," he said. He took a few steps forward, not many, but enough to carry him out of the shadow in the tree and into a softer light beyond it. Each step was careful, but not uncertain. He moved as though he was learning the shape of his own strength, discovering where it lay and how it might be used. Ben Weatherstaff watched him closely. The old gardener had seen many things in his life, but this held him in a way he didn't quite understand. There was a pride in it, certainly, but there was also a kind of wonder, which he didn't trouble to hide. "He's doing it," he muttered under his breath, not intending to be heard, though Dickon caught the words and gave the smallest nod. Colin stepped a few paces and turned back towards them. "We must stay together," he said. "That is part of it." He paused as if choosing his words carefully, though it had already taken shape in his mind. "Magic is in me," he said slowly. "Magic is making me well." He looked at Mary. "You must say it." Mary didn't hesitate. She had never been one to shrink from one thing once she understood it, and though she could not have explained why, she felt no foolishness in saying it. "Magic is in me," she repeated. "Magic is making me well." Dickon followed, his voice quiet and even. "Magic is in me. Magic is making me well." Ben Weatherstaff shifted his weight, as though uncertain for the briefest moment, but then he straightened himself. "Magic is in me," he said, somewhat gruffly, though not without care. "Magic is making me well." The words did not ring out loudly. They did not echo or startle the air. They were spoken simply, and yet, when they had been said, there was a stillness afterwards which felt fuller than before. Colin stood listening to it, as though he expected something to happen at once. But nothing did. Not in any visible way. The garden remained as it was. The breeze moved lightly through the leaves, and somewhere a bird called and was answered. And yet, something had been altered. Colin drew another breath and lifted his head a little higher. "It must be done every day," he said, "and many times in the day. We must remember it." "Yes," said Mary. "Yes," said Dickon. "Aye," said Ben Weatherstaff. Colin took another step, and then another. This time he didn't stop so quickly. He moved across the grass slowly, but with a steadiness that grew as he went. He did not look down at his feet, but ahead, as though he trusted them to follow. Mary walked a little behind him, not near enough to steady him, but near enough to see if he should falter. Dickon moved at the other side, his quiet presence as natural as the growing things around them. They did not speak again at once. It didn't seem necessary. The garden itself appeared to go on with its work, indifferent and yet companionable. Leaves stirred, shadows shifted, and the flowers lifted their faces to the light. A bee moved from one bloom to the other, pausing only long enough to gather what it needed before continuing on. Colin walked as far as the sundial before he stopped. He stood there, looking at it, though it was not the stone itself that held his attention, but the space around it, the way the roses had begun to wind themselves around it, the way the grass had grown thick at its base. "It is alive," he said quietly. Mary came to stand beside him. "Yes," she answered. He was silent for a moment, and then he spoke again, more softly. "It is doing something all the time." Dickon nodded. "It always is," he said. Colin looked down at his hands, as though considering them, and then back again at the garden. "Then I shall do something too," he said. There was no strain in the words, and no urgency. They were spoken as simply as the others had been, but they carried with them the same quiet certainty. He remained standing a little longer, and then, without reluctance, he lowered himself carefully to the grass. He didn't sink down as he once might have done, with a kind of collapse, but sat with intention, arranging himself as though he had chosen to do so. Mary sat near him, and Dickon settled himself on the other side, the animals quiet and content. For a time, they watched together. Nothing in the garden hurried, and nothing seemed to wait. It went on, growing and unfolding, whether it was observed or not. But because they were there, because they had begun to look, it seemed to offer itself more readily, as though it didn't mind being seen. And in that stillness, without any clear dividing line, the moment passed into something deeper. Not a pause, but a continuation, steady and unbroken. "Do you think the experiment will work?" Colin asked, turning his head toward Dickon with a look that was both earnest and searching. There were times when he studied Dickon closely, as though he believed there might be something to discover in him, not something hidden, not exactly, but something understood without being spoken. Dickon's smile widened a little, as it often did when he was pleased, and there was a quiet certainty in his answer. "Aye," he said, "that I do. It'll work same as the seeds do when the sun shines on them. It'll work for sure. Shall us begin it now?" Colin's face brightened at once, and Mary felt the same quickening of interest. There was something in the suggestion which made it seem as though they were about to do something both simple and important, though it had been difficult to say exactly what. "We will sit down," Colin said. "It will be like sitting in a sort of temple." He moved carefully toward the tree, and when he reached it, he lowered himself to the ground with more ease than he had shown before. He did not seem troubled by the effort, though he drew a breath afterward and added, almost without thinking, "I am rather tired." "Eh," Dickon said at once. with a gentle firmness that was not unkind. "Thou mustn't begin by saying thou'rt tired. That might spoil the magic." Colin looked at him surprised, and then his expression changed. He seemed to consider the words not as a rebuke, but as something to be understood. "Oh, that's true," he said slowly. "I must only think of the magic." They settled themselves in a small circle beneath the tree. The branches spread above them, forming a canopy through which the light fell in soft patches, shifting gently as the leaves moved. It gave the place a quiet enclosure, not shut away, but held. Ben Weatherstaff stood for a moment, as though uncertain how he ought to take his place in such a gathering. But then he lowered himself, somewhat stiffly, as he sat as the others did. There was a look about him which might have been amusement, or curiosity, or perhaps both, but he didn't speak of it. Mary folded her hands loosely in her lap and felt a strange stillness come over her. Not an emptiness, but a kind of attention, as though she were listening for something that had not yet begun. Dickon sat easily, as he always did, the white rabbit resting against his arm, the small creatures about him settling one by one. The crow came first, alighting nearby without disturbance, then the fox, moving with quiet steps, lay down at a little distance, its eyes half closed. The squirrels followed, pausing only briefly before drawing nearer, and the lamb came last, slow and gentle, and rested close beside Dickon. It didn't seem strange to any of them that the animals should come. It felt rather as though they had always been part of it. "The creatures have come," Colin said, his voice low, but filled with a certain gravity. "They want to help us." Mary glanced at him. There was something different in his manner now. Not the impatience she had once known, nor even the determined tone he had used before, but something quieter and more composed, as though he had taken upon himself a role he intended to carry out with care. The light fell across his face, and it gave him, for a moment, a look which made Mary think of something she could not quite name. Not older, exactly, but settled. "Now we will begin," he said. "We will not sway, we will only chant." "Oh, I cannot do no chanting," Ben Weatherstaff said, with a touch of uneasiness. "They turned me out of the church choir the only time I ever tried it." No one laughed. The moment did not allow it. There was no sharpness in the air, no lightness that would break it. They were all, in different ways, attentive to what was about to happen. "Then I will chant," Colin said. He sat very straight, his hands resting upon his knees, his eyes lifted slightly. For a brief moment he didn't speak, as though he were gathering the words together within himself. Then slowly he began. "The sun is shining. The sun is shining. That is the magic. The flowers are growing. The roots are stirring. That is the magic." His voice was not loud, but it was steady. It moved in a quiet rhythm, not hurried, not uneven, as though it followed something already in motion. "Being alive is the magic. Being strong is the magic. The magic is in me. The magic is in me." He repeated it, not in haste, but with a certain calm persistence. "It is in me. It is in me. It is in every one of us." The words seemed to settle into the space around them, just as they had before, but now they didn't remain still. They seemed to move with the air, with the soft stirring of the leaves, with the low hum of bees among the blossoms. "Magic," he said quietly. "Magic. Come and help." He said it again and again, not counting the repetitions, not measuring them, but continuing as long as it felt necessary. The others didn't interrupt him. They didn't speak. They listened. Mary felt something within her grow quiet and yet more awake at the same time. The words didn't seem strange to her now. They seemed to belong to the garden, to the morning, to the stillness that held them. Ben Weatherstaff, who had begun by sitting rather stiffly, found his shoulders easing He didn't notice when it happened. The sound of Colin's voice, steady and unbroken, mingled with the other softer sounds about them. The distant call of a bird, the faint rustle of leaves, the slow, constant hum of bees. Dickon sat with his head slightly bent, his hand resting lightly upon the lamb's back, the rabbit still and content in the curve of his arm. His eyes had softened, and there was something in his stillness that seemed to answer the quiet around them. Time passed, though it wasn't marked. At length, Colin's voice slowed, then ceased. He remained sitting for a moment, as though listening for something more, and then he opened his eyes fully and looked about him. "Now I'm going to walk around the garden." Ben Weatherstaff started slightly, his head lifting with a small jerk. "You have been asleep," Colin said. "Not o' the sort," Ben replied, though his voice was thick with drowsiness. "The sermon was good enow, but I'm bound to get out before the collection." "You're not in church," Colin said. "Not me," Ben answered, straightening himself. "Who said I were? I heard every bit of it. You said the magic was in my back. The doctor calls it rheumatics." Colin looked at him, and for a moment there was the faintest suggestion of a smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. Then he rose again, steadying himself, and turned toward the path, as though what he had said before he meant now to prove. Colin lifted his hand with a small gesture, as though dismissing something not worth keeping. "That was the wrong magic," he said. "You will get better. You have my permission to go to your work, but come back tomorrow." Ben Weatherstaff gave a short grunt, which was not unfriendly, though it was a grunt nonetheless. "I'd like to see thee walk around the garden," he said. He did not say more, but he had already made up his mind that if he were sent away, he would not go far. There were ways of seeing without being seen, and he would have found one of them. He didn't trust wholly in magic. Not yet, but he trusted his own eyes, and he meant to keep them on the boy. Colin didn't object to his staying, and so they set out together. It had the look of a procession, though none of them had planned it so. Colin walked at the front, with Dickon beside him on one side and Mary on the other. Ben Weatherstaff followed just behind, his step uneven but determined, and the animals came after them. The lamb close to Dickon, the fox moving lightly, the white rabbit stopping now and then as though to consider a tuft of grass, and Soot following with grave importance, as if he understood himself to be part of the affair. They moved slowly, but there was no haste in it. Every few yards they paused, not from reluctance, but because the effort required it. Colin leaned on Dickon's arm when he must, but there were moments, small but unmistakable, when he let go and took a few steps alone. Each time he did so, his head lifted a little higher. "The magic is in me," he said under his breath, and then more clearly, "The magic is making me strong. I can feel it." He said it again, as though the saying of it gave it weight. They passed along the paths, through the growing spaces, past the places where the flowers had begun to rise and open. Once or twice Colin sat upon a low seat, and once he sank down upon the grass, resting only as long as he must, before rising again. He would not give up until he had gone all the way around. When at last they came back beneath the canopy tree, his cheeks were flushed, and there was a brightness in his eyes that had nothing to do with weariness. "I did it," he cried. "The magic worked. That is my first scientific discovery." Mary's first thought leapt ahead of her. "What will Dr. Craven say?" she asked. Colin's answer came at once. "He won't say anything," he replied, "because he will not be told. This is to be the biggest secret of all." He stood quite still as he spoke, as though fixing the idea firmly. "No one is to know anything about it until I've grown so strong that I can walk and run like any other boy. I shall come here every day in my chair, and I shall be taken back in it. I won't have people whispering and asking questions, and I won't let my father hear about it until the experiment has quite succeeded." There was a quiet certainty in him, which did not invite contradiction. "Then, when we come back," Colin went on, "I shall walk into his room and say, 'Here I am. I am like any other boy. I am quite well, and I shall live to be a man. It has been done by a scientific experiment.'" Mary's eyes widened. "He will think he's in a dream," she said. "He won't believe his eyes." Colin's face flushed again, but this time it was not only from exertion. There was a deep satisfaction in the picture he had formed, one that he had turned over in his mind more than once. "He will be obliged to believe them," he said. He stood for a moment in silence, and though he didn't speak it aloud, there was something else in his thoughts, a memory not so far away of what it had been to lie still and feel himself shut away from everything, even from those who should have cared most. That memory didn't vanish, but it no longer held him as it once had. "I am going to be an athlete," he said suddenly, "after the magic works, and before I begin to make scientific discoveries." Ben Weatherstaff gave a short laugh. "We shall have thee taken to boxing in a week or so," he said. "Thou'll end up winning the belt and being champion prize fighter of all of England." Colin turned his head and looked at him with an unexpected sternness. "Weatherstaff," he said, "that is disrespectful. You must not take liberties because you are in the secret. However much the magic works, I shall not be a prize fighter. I shall be a scientific discoverer." Ben touched his forehead at once. Ask pardon, sir," he said. "I ought to have seed it wasn't a joking matter." But though he spoke respectfully, there was a brightness in his eyes which showed that he was pleased rather than offended. The boy's spirit had risen, and he knew it. Colin didn't press the matter further. He had said what he meant, and that was enough. He looked once more about the garden, the growing things, the paths, the quiet movement of the leaves and the light, and drew a long, steady breath. It didn't feel to him now like a place he visited. It felt like something he belonged within. The earth had already begun to warm by the time the light reached across the moor. It didn't come all at once, but slowly, spreading in a pale wash over the low stone wall, touching the rough edges of it, then slipping quietly into the enclosed space beyond, where rows of small green things had begun their steady, patient rising. Dickon was already there. He had been there early, as he often was, when the air still held the faint chill of night and the soil turned easily beneath his hands. There was no haste in the way he worked. He moved as though he understood the rhythm of the place, and he meant only to follow it. Loosening the earth, setting things right, pausing now and then to look, not just with judgment, but with a kind of quiet companionship. Sometimes he whistled under his breath, or sang a line or two of a song that seemed to belong to the open spaces. Sometimes he spoke softly to the creature who kept near him, as though they were part of the work itself, and not merely watchers of it. The low wall, built of rough stones and softened by time, held the garden close. In its crevices, small flowers had taken root, foxglove and fern, bits of green and color tucked wherever they might find space to grow. Nothing seemed forced there. Everything had found its own place, and in doing so, made the whole feel quietly complete. It was in the long, gentle stretch of the evening light that Mrs. Sowerby liked best to come and sit. When the day's work was done, and the air settled into the calm hour between labor and rest, she would walk out across the moor and take her place upon the low wall, her hands folded easily in her lap, her eyes moving over the garden as though it were something she knew well and trusted. She didn't interrupt Dickon as he worked. She watched and listened, and now and then asked a question, not because she didn't understand, but because she liked to hear the way he told things. That evening, when she spoke, there was a note of quiet amusement in her voice. She said, that pair's enjoying theirselves, I warned. There's nothing children like as much as play-acting. Let's hear what they do, Dickon lad. Dickon sat back on his heels once, brushing the earth lightly from his hands. There was a brightness in his eyes that had not been there earlier, a kind of contained laughter, as though the memory of it had been waiting. Mr. Colin is carried down to his chair every time he goes out, he began, and he flies out at John, the footman, for not carrying him careful enough. He makes himself as helpless looking as he can, and never lifts his head till we're out of sight and out the house. Miss Sowerby's mouth curved. Does he now? Aye, Dickon went on, and he grunts and frets a good bit when he's being settled. Him and Miss Mary, they've both got to enjoying it. When he groans, she'll say, Poor Colin, does it hurt you so much? Are you so weak as that, poor Colin? His voice softened with laughter he did not quite let loose. But the trouble is, he added, they can scarce keep from bursting out laughing. When we get safe into the garden, they laugh till they've no breath left to laugh with, and they've to hide their faces in the cushions so no one of the gardeners hears, if any's about. Mrs. Sowerby gave a low, comfortable laugh that seemed to settle into the air rather than disturb it. The more they laugh, the better for 'em, she said. Good, healthy laughing's better than pills any day of the year. That pair will plump up for sure. They are plumping up, Dickon said. They're that hungry they don't know how to get enough to eat without making talk. Mr. Colin says if he keeps sending for more food, they won't believe he's an invalid at all. And Miss Mary, she says she'll give him her share, Dickon answered. But he says if she goes hungry, she'll get thin, and they mun both get fat at once. Mrs. Sowerby shook her head a little, though her eyes were smiling. There was no surprise in her, only a quiet satisfaction, as though something she had expected had begun, at last, to show itself plainly. She sat for a time without speaking, her gaze resting not on Dickon now, but on the small, steady work of growing things, the leaves opening, the stems lifting, the quiet insistence of life moving forward without announcement. In that stillness, it was easy to understand how she had known, even before she had been told, that something was changing. Not all at once, not in a way that called attention to itself, but in the way that healthy things change, gradually, surely, and with a kind of quiet certainty that did not need to be named. At last, she drew a breath and spoke again, more thoughtfully now. And what do they make of that at the manor? She asked, him being so well and cheerful and never complaining. Dickon gave a small grin. They don't know what to make of it, he said. Every day his face looks different. It's filling out, and the waxy colour's going. But he has to do a bit of complaining now and then to keep 'em from guessing. What for? I mercy's name, she asked. Dickon's grin widened. He does it so they don't find out, he said. If the doctor knew he could stand, he'd write to Mr. Craven. Mr. Colin's keeping the secret till he's strong enough. He's going to practice his magic every day till his father comes back, and then he'll walk to him, straight as any lad. Miss Sowerby's laughter came again, softer this time, but deeper. There was no disbelief in it, only warmth, only knowing. And, as the last of the light settled over the small garden, and the work of the day came gently to its end, the quiet truth of it seemed to rest there with them, that strength was growing, whether it was spoken or not, and that laughter, as much as anything, had begun to make its home in the place where it was most needed. Mrs. Sowerby laughed so heartily at the telling of it that she rocked gently where she sat upon the low wall, her blue cloak shifting about her shoulders as the sound of it warmed the quiet evening air. Dickon laughed with her, though his laughter came more softly, and though he held it close rather than letting it run free. I'll tell thee what, lad, she said at last, when she caught her breath. I've thought of a way to help them. When thou goes to them in the morning, thou shalt take a pail of good new milk, and I'll bake 'em a crusty cottage loaf, or maybe a few buns with currants in 'em, same as you children like. There's nothing so good as fresh milk and bread. It'll take the edge off the hunger while they're in the garden, and the fine food indoors 'll do the rest." Mother," Dickon said, his voice full of admiration. "What a wonder thou art. Thou always sees a way out of things." "They're two young uns growing fast," she said, still smiling, "and health's coming back to both of 'em. Children like that feel hunger is keen. They want food same as young creatures do, and they're enjoying themselves. That's plain enough." She spoke it simply, as though there were no mystery in it at all, only the steady return of what had always been meant to be there. And in truth, there was something in her manner which made it seem so. The children's secret, their careful pretending, their hidden laughter, their whispered plans, had not been undone by her knowing. It had only been steadied, as though it had found a place to rest in stronger hands. The idea of their play-actin', as she called it, delighted her. It delighted them as well, for there was something in pretending which made the truth feel safer, as though it could grow quietly without being disturbed. The puzzled looks of the nurse, the careful questions of the doctor, the watchful eyes in the manor, all these things had taught them caution without quite teaching them fear. "Your appetite is improving very much, Master Colin," the nurse had said one morning, watching him closely. "You used to eat nothing, and so many things disagreed with you." "Nothing disagrees with me now," Colin answered quickly, and then catching a look in his eyes, he checked himself. "At least, not so often. It's the fresh air." "Perhaps it is," she said, though she did not look convinced. "But I must speak with Dr. Craven about it." Mary had frowned when the nurse left. "How she stared at you," she said, as if she thought there must be something to find out. "I won't have her finding things out," Colin said at once. "No one must begin to find out yet." And when Dr. Craven came that same day, he, too, looked puzzled. "You stay out in the garden a great deal," he remarked. "Where do you go?" Colin drew himself up with an air of quiet authority. "I will not let anyone know where I go," he said. "I go to a place I like. Everyone has orders to keep out of the way. I won't be watched and stared at." The doctor regarded him thoughtfully. "You seem to be out all day, and I do not think it has done you harm," he said. "The nurse tells me you eat much more than you have ever done before." "Perhaps," said Colin, after a moment's pause. "Perhaps it is an unnatural appetite." "I do not think so," Dr. Craven replied. "Your food seems to agree with you. You are gaining strength, and your color is better." Colin lowered his eyes as though considering. Perhaps I am feverish," he said, in a tone of sudden discouragement. "People who are not going to live are often different." Dr. Craven shook his head, taking his wrist as he spoke. "You are not feverish," he said quietly, "and such strength as you have gained is healthy strength. If it continues, we need not speak of dying. Your father will be glad to hear of such improvement." Colin stared up at once. "I won't have him told," he cried. "I will only disappoint him if I get worse again, and I may get worse tonight. I feel as if I might be beginning to have a fever now. I won't have letters written. I won't. I hate being written about and talked over." "Hush, hush, my boy," the doctor said gently. "Nothing shall be written without your permission. You must not excite yourself." He said no more of it, though afterward he spoke privately to the nurse, cautioning her not to mention any such thing. "The boy is better," he said, "but he must not be disturbed. He excites himself too easily." Mary and Colin spoke of it together later, more seriously than before. From that time, their plan of play-actin' became more careful. "I may be obliged to have a tantrum," Colin said reluctantly. "I don't want to have one, but I may not be miserable enough now to make it real. That lump does not come into my throat any more, and I keep thinking of nice things instead of dreadful ones." Mary looked at him thoughtfully. "We must be very careful," she said. Colin nodded. But even as he spoke of being careful, even as he tried to imagine ways to appear weaker than he felt, there was something quietly working against him. For each morning, when he woke, there was an eagerness in him, which he could not quite suppress. And when breakfast came, he found that his appetite would not be reasoned with. The small table beside his chair was set with simple, plentiful things: fresh bread, butter, eggs, and jam, and sometimes other dishes besides. Mary always sat with him, and more than once they found themselves looking at one another with a kind of helpless amusement when the meal before them seemed far greater than either had intended to eat. "I think we shall eat it all this morning, Mary," Colin would say, with a seriousness which did not quite hide his satisfaction, and Mary, trying not to smile, would agree. For though they spoke of caution and planned their careful disguises, there was something stronger than their plans quietly at work within them, something that could not be hidden and did not wish to be. There was no longer any real question of sending food away. At first, they had spoken of it quite seriously, as though it were something that must be done, something proper and necessary to maintain appearances. But when the trays were set before them, and the covers lifted, they found, without quite meaning to, that nothing remained to be sent back at all. The plates returned to the pantry, polished clean. This did not go unnoticed. "I do wish," Colin said once, with a thoughtful air, "that the slices of ham were thicker, and one muffin each is not enough for anyone." Mary looked at him, trying to remember how such a statement might once have sounded. "It is enough for a person who is going to die," she said, "but it is not enough for a person who is going to live. I sometimes feel as if I could eat 3 when the air comes in from the moor." The window had been open that morning, and the scent of heather and gorse had drifted on into the light breeze, bringing with it something that seemed to sharpen the appetite rather than soothe it. It was on such a morning that Dickon came to them after they had already spent a good hour or more in the garden. He did not come at once into view. Instead, he slipped behind a large rose bush, and when he emerged, he carried with him 2 small tin pails. There was a quiet triumph in the way he set them down. One was filled with rich new milk, thick with cream at top, still cool and fresh. The other held a bundle wrapped carefully in a clean and blue-white cloth. When he unfolded it, the warmth escaped at once. Inside were currant buns. They were still hot. For a moment, neither Colin nor Mary spoke. The surprise of it, so simple and yet so perfectly timed, seemed almost too much to take in at once. Then the delight came. It rose all at once, bright and unrestrained, and for a little while they forgot everything else. The manner, the watching eyes, the careful pretenses. They ate as though the morning itself had made them hungry. "How good they are," Mary said softly. "And the milk," Colin added, taking another long drink, "is the best I've ever tasted." He paused then, with sudden seriousness. "Magic is in her, just as it is in Dickon. It makes her think of ways to do things, good things. She is a magic person." He considered a moment longer, then added, with great dignity, "Tell her we are grateful, Dickon, extremely grateful." But the dignity did not last. Before long he had forgotten it entirely and was eating as any hungry boy would, quickly, contently, without ceremony. And from that morning, such small feasts became part of their days. They did not at first think of what it might cost Miss Sowerby to provide them, but when the thought came, it came with enough force that they could not ignore it. She had many mouths to feed already, and it was not right that she should take on more without question. So they made a plan of another sort. They would send a little money, just enough to provide what was needed, and no more. Dickon brought back what was required, and with it came something else, a discovery. There was, in a small hollow beyond the garden, a place where stones could be set in such a way as to make a kind of oven. It wasn't large, nor carefully made, but it was enough. There, they roasted potatoes and eggs. The taste of them, eaten in the open air, with a pinch of salt and fresh butter melting into the heat, seemed to them better than anything that had ever been served upon silver dishes. There was no sense of taking from anyone. There was only the pleasure of it. And so their days took on a new rhythm. Each morning, the magic was worked beneath the spreading branches of the tree, the leaves thickening above them as the seasons moved on. And after, Colin walked. At first only a little, then farther still. Each day he grew stronger, and each day his belief grew with him, steady, unquestioned, as though it had taken root within him and would not be moved. He tried small experiments, testing what he could do, learning what his strength would bear. And Dickon, watching him, showed him something more. "One day," he said, "I went to Thwaite and spoke with Bob Haworth. He's the strongest man on the moor. I asked him how he came by it." Colin listened at once, intent and eager. Dickon told a story simply, of a man who had learned to exercise every part of his body, of the strength that came, not all at once, but bit by bit, with care and practice. "I thought of thee," Dickon said, "and I watched what he did till I knew it well." "Can you show me?" Colin asked at once. "Will you?" "Aye," Dickon answered, rising to his feet. "But thou mun do it gently first. Rest between times, and don't overdo." "I will be careful," Colin said quickly. "Show me." Dickon began with movements so simple they seemed almost nothing at all, raising the arms, turning, bending, steadying. Colin watched closely. At first, he tried them sitting. Then, slowly, he stood. There was no suddenness in it, only a careful lifting, a steadying, a pause. And then he was upright, doing the same small movements with a concentration that left no room for anything else. Mary began to do them too. Nearby, Soot watched with growing agitation, hopping from one place to another, as though he felt he ought to join in, and could not understand why he was left out. The moment passed, but it didn't fade. From then on, the exercises became a part of every day, no less important than the magic, and perhaps, though they didn't say it aloud, part of it. And with each passing day, the change became harder to hide. For though they still played their parts when they must, though Colin still remembered to frown and Mary to speak softly when others were near, there was something beneath it all that could not be disguised. Strength. It showed itself in the way he stood, in the way he walked, in the way he laughed without thinking to stop himself. And though the house remained as it had always been, quiet, watchful, uncertain, there was something growing within it that would not remain hidden forever. Not now. Not much longer. It was talked of downstairs, though never quite in the same way twice. "They are eating next to nothing," the nurse would say, with a troubled shake of her head. "They will starve themselves if they go on so. And yet, look at them." "Look," Mrs. Medlock answered, almost indignantly. "I am murdered to death with them, I am. One day they'll eat as if they've never seen food before, and the next they turn up their noses at the best kitchen can send. Not a bite of the beautiful fowl yesterday, and cook near in tears over it." There was no sense made of it. The trays came back scarcely touched, and yet the children themselves did not fade as one might expect. They didn't grow weaker. They didn't grow pale. Quite the opposite. And this is what troubled them most. When Dr. Craven came and was told of it, he listened without interruption, though his expression grew more and more intent. He had been away for some time and had not seen Colin in nearly a fortnight. When at last he entered the room and looked at the boy, he didn't speak at once. Something in his face changed. He studied him closely, more closely perhaps than he had ever done before. The sallowness had gone. In its place, there was a warmth of color beneath the skin, a faint rose that seemed to come and go with the breath and movement. The hollows in his face had softened. His eyes were clearer. Even his hair seemed different. No longer dull and heavy, but lying more lightly, as though it belonged to someone who had stepped out of the shadow into air. It was, in a way, unsettling, for this was not how an invalid ought to look. "I'm sorry to hear that you do not eat," Dr. Craven said at last, seating himself beside him. "That will not do. You have gained a great deal, and very quickly. You must not lose it." "I told you," Colin replied, with a certain composed gravity, "that this was an unnatural appetite." Mary, who was sitting nearby, made a sudden sound, a small, strangled noise she tried at once to hide. Dr. Craven turned to her. "What is the matter?" She sat up very straight. "It was nothing," she said. "Something between a sneeze and a cough." But when his attention moved away again, she bent slightly toward Colin, her voice dropping. "I couldn't help it," she whispered. "I was remembering that enormous potato and the way you ate it." Colin's eyes flickered with something like laughter, but he held it back. He must. There were still parts to be played. "Is there any way," Dr. Craven asked later, turning to Mrs. Medlock, "that they might be obtaining food without our knowledge?" "There is no way," she answered firmly. "They see no one but each other. If they want anything different, they've only got to ask for it." Dr. Craven considered this. "Well," he said after a moment, "so long as it appears to agree with them, we need not be over-anxious. The boy is changed." "So is the girl," Mrs. Medlock added. "She's not the same sharp little thing she was. There's colour in her now, and she laughs. The two of them together, well, you'd think they'd gone a bit wild with it." "Perhaps they have," said Dr. Craven quietly. He paused, and then, with a kind of thoughtful resignation, added, "Let them laugh." And so they did. They laughed in the garden, where no one could hear them. They laughed over their small feast and their secret plans. They laughed at nothing at all, simply because they could. And though the house continued to watch and wonder and try to make sense of what it saw, there was something it could not account for. Something that didn't belong to medicine or routine or careful observation. Something that grew stronger with each passing day. It lived in the air beneath the trees. It moved in the sunlight that fell across the grass. It stirred in breath and in movement and in quiet moments when no one spoke at all. And whether it was called by name or not, it went on working, steady and unseen, changing everything it touched. Not suddenly, not all at once, but surely. And now, at last, it was very near to being known. And now, the garden grows quiet once more. Beyond the walls of Misselthwaite Manor, the evening settles soft over the earth, and the wind moves gently across the wide Yorkshire moor. Within the hidden garden, the day's laughter has faded into stillness. The branches rest, the soft grass lies undisturbed, and the quiet holds all that has been growing, unseen but certain. They have laughed. They have walked. They have begun to change. And though the house still wonders and watches and tries to understand, the garden does not question. It simply continues to work. What has taken root there is not yet fully known, but it is stronger now than it has ever been before. And it will not remain hidden for long. That, too, will come. And when you return, we will discover it together. For now, the garden rests. The moor lies calm and open, and the last light fades softly across the ground. Let the quiet of the garden drift gently around you. Let the soft winds of the moor carry your thoughts far away, and allow the story to rest here for tonight. You are safe. You are loved. You've been listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle, and your sleep be deep.